Good morning, everybody. This is Tony Jacobson at Jewish Family Service. In partnership with the Federation, we're excited to bring you today's workshop on managing disruptive behaviors. I wanted to tell you a minute about how this workshop came to be. As the social work agency of the community, we felt like it was important to bring a de-escalation skill building workshop to anybody that works in the Jewish community in order to increase our comfort level in working with people with disruptive behaviors, whether that person has a mental health diagnosis or whether it's just a typical person that's having a bad day. We have seen that some people with more serious diagnoses unintentionally become excluded from the community. And that's really because we aren't that comfortable dealing with disruptive behaviors. So we hope that this workshop will help you walk away with some tools and some more confidence. We chose Steve Cremando to do this workshop, and most of us know him as the security safety expert, but he also has 30+ experience as a frontline responder as a behavioral health specialist. So those two groups of experience mixed together, we feel make him the perfect presenter for this program. So thank you for coming again, and thank you for the Federation for funding this program. Take it away, Steve.
Well, thank you, Tony, and good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for making time to join the program today. Let's do a little bit of housekeeping first before we get going. Please use the chat window as the primary way to communicate with myself or Tony through the program, and also to enter any sort of questions that you'd like us to address at the end of the program. Please note that the program is being recorded, and a link to that will be made available at some point, but also I'll be providing Tony with a copy of the slides as a PDF. There's a lot of material here. We're going to go through it pretty quickly, but you also remember that you have the recording and you have the slides to go back to if you'd like to look more deeply into any one area. Having said that, I'm going to jump into the program and get going. Tony did a great introduction for me. I'm not going to belabor it too much further, other than to say that for the past 30 years, I've spent my work really at the intersection of human behavior and emergency management and security. Started out working really again in psychiatric emergency rooms at hospitals all around my region, which is just outside of New York City, and eventually working my way through the system to be a trainer for the Department of Homeland Security in threat evaluation and crisis management. So I've had the good fortune for 30 years to be part of many different sorts of experiences, to work as part of a police hostage negotiation team, and really learn a lot about how to communicate with people during different sorts of emotional and behavioral crises. And I'd like to share much of that with you today during our program. Our program, again, is going to cover, as Tony said, a range of different sorts of emotional and behavioral crises. And we talk about those, some are going to be rooted in different sorts of mental health conditions, whether they're diagnosed or not diagnosed. And some will be, as Tony mentioned as well, situational and people's response to their life environment and the current circumstances. We're going to do all of that while simultaneously preserving people's dignity and trying to move them toward the right sort of help. And a lot of that will have a focus on our own safety and security using skills such as verbal de-escalation. We'll also talk lastly about really the impact on ourselves of dealing with sometimes disruptive or even hostile behavior, and how we take care of ourselves emotionally and psychologically as well through these sorts of crises. So our objectives then are, by the end of the program, a better understanding and recognition of responding safely to these behavioral emergencies, identifying and trying to acquire some new skills or refining your existing skills for these situations, and really as a community and an organization, enhancing our abilities to respond more effectively and compassionately to these situations, understanding that we're really all in this together and we can make a critical difference, not only in de-escalating a situation and making it safe, but moving someone towards the right sort of help. We'll do this with a preparedness mindset. Really, again, you'll hear me several times throughout the program that our goal is to respond to these situations, not to react to these situations. Now, having said that, we are in a very, very unusual time. I've been doing this sort of training for nearly 30 years, and of course, never in a global pandemic. I have worked in public health emergencies of all different sorts over the years, but this has been obviously something much longer, much more serious, and much more complex. But I do want to talk to you about the mental health implications of this. And really, we look at two studies very quickly, the Kaiser Family Foundation studies that have been ongoing and the American Psychological Association's annual Stress in America surveys. And what they tell us is, at the baseline, more than half of all American adults surveyed have reported significant deterioration in their mental health condition over the course of the pandemic. The youngest amongst us having the more serious and more pronounced sorts of deterioration or reactions to this. So when you think that today in the United States, 1 out of 4, and that number has really been revised recently from 1 out of 5 to 1 out of 4 Americans now have some sort of diagnosable mental health condition, that in this scenario, during and after the pandemic, that number is roughly 1 in 2 people is reporting or are reporting very significant mental health sorts of challenges. So we have many more people right now struggling with their mental health who have, again, maybe never been part of the formal process of receiving mental health care or diagnosis. The other thing that's going to be very important to us is most research in this area tells us that even when the virus, COVID-19, starts to abate, that the mental health demand for services, for care, is likely to just begin escalating. And if we look at this study from the public health system in the United Kingdom, the National Center for Mental Health, we understand that they're projecting that the demand for mental health services will increase by 2 to 3 times over their existing capacity over the next 3 to 5 years following the pandemic. So we know public health emergencies and pandemics in specific have a very, very long shadow in terms of their mental health demand. The timing of this program and the timing of us developing enhanced skills to deal with these challenges has actually never been more important. So certainly I applaud Tony and the organization and all of you for the thinking about, really bringing this discussion to the fore and enhancing our skills. The other thing we know is whenever we're in times of increased uncertainty, and if just at the baseline, you have to remember that pandemics are predictably unpredictable, so they do create a tremendous amount of uncertainty, as we're all keenly aware of. We know that those times of financial and emotional precariousness, we know those times when there is financial insecurity actually become the breeding ground for conspiracies as well, and lots of extreme thought and lots of extreme opinions. Certainly in an open and democratic society where we value people's opinions and want to give people the opportunity for expression and free speech, we know there can be some opinions and some attitudes that are even beyond the pale, and some of them may actually represent delusional thought. But here, we know that all conspiracies essentially are rooted around some sort of perceived grievance. And if you're not familiar, the graphic to my side really is the pathway to violence. And you clearly see the grievance is the entryway to that pathway. Not to saying that everyone with a grievance goes on to become violent, but it certainly becomes a risk factor. So when we take all of these ideas together, we understand that where we are in the pandemic and the current environment and where we're likely to be going really creates some very, very significant behavioral and emotional challenges. Some that we started to see surface very quickly at the onset of the pandemic, when people went back, went into lockdown, left their normal jobs and normal routines. We all had to start isolating and so forth, up to the very moment with people's feelings about masks, vaccines, distancing mandates, and all the things that we speak about related to the pandemic certainly have increased people's fear, frustration, anger, and distrust. So we're in a very, very volatile sort of environment. And even as we start to come, hopefully, out of the pandemic, and lots of good news around things like vaccines and medications, and just, again, the natural course of the disease hopefully beginning to extinguish, people, again, have new emotional challenges. Returning to work in person and school, people have strong feelings about that. Changes back to pre-existing daily routines and maybe starting to commute again for the first time in a long time. Again, lots of feelings about government mandates government positions, employers' positions. And again, if we think about this, lots of grievances to go around, and some people outright anger at the situation, depending on their, their view and their position. But we know that there were a number of lingering sorts of emotional challenges as well. The isolation people experienced, being in close quarters, both working and maybe having children schooling from home. And of course, for those families that had illness or even deaths in the family related to COVID, this has been an incredibly painful time. It's hard to even put in perspective the number of losses we've actually had here in the US and around the world. But as I said, if nothing else, a time of extreme uncertainty, anger, frustration, and for people who had pre-existing mental health conditions, they may have been greatly exacerbated by these challenges. So whatever normal challenges there may have been, or day-to-day challenges in our communities around, assisting individuals with mental health challenges, substance abuse, and other problems, those actually become much more intense throughout the last 20 months. So we believe this is the right time, and we believe these are the right skills, including really enhancing our verbal de-escalation skills and knowing how to help individuals in mental health crises and emotional crises. And I'm going to spend more time kind of differentiating those two categories in just a few moments. But when we think about verbal de-escalation, it's not a script, it's not a formula, and there's no specific magic words that are going to help calm an emotionally overwhelmed individual. It's really, again, about how we control ourselves in a manner that influences the other person to calm and control themselves. So we're going to focus a lot on that idea. But let's start with this key concept, which is Lewin's equation. Many of you may be familiar. Dr. Kurt Lewin is thought to be the father of social psychology, and Lewin had famously said that human behavior is a function of the interaction between the person and their environment. When you think today about our environment, it is not just the pandemic, although the pandemic's been very central to this. We've had record-setting wildfire seasons up and down the West Coast, tremendous storms, in fact, record-setting number of hurricanes and tropical storms this year. We have had, again, huge incidents of civil unrest and likely more to come. And as I said, all of that against the backdrop of a very tense political and media environment that has kept many, many people on edge. So in these environments, and of course in general, day-to-day in life, we understand that we have to remain vigilant. People are tense, people are on edge. Many more people are reporting mental health challenges than ever before, and individuals with pre-existing mental health challenges are under a great demand, a different sort of challenge and stress than they ever have before that can again exacerbate their conditions. We have to take care, and this again goes back to the idea of pandemic fatigue, that because we have become somewhat familiar and somewhat desensitized and maybe even exhausted emotionally over the last 20 months, that we understand one of the key factors in pandemic fatigue is habituation or acclimation to the new environment so we can continue to function, but that means that we are likely to drop our guards. And we understand one of the greatest threats to our safety in any kind of a behavioral challenge is when we get too complacent, we feel too comfortable, and we stop really being, concerned about our safety or the behavior of others around us. Probably more important right now than ever before that we stay tuned in and we're vigilant, that we're aware of things like normalcy bias that has us believe that things will always be the same and nothing's changed, or optimism bias that things will work out just fine, or recency bias that nothing has happened lately, so it probably won't. There are many ways our minds play tricks on us that make us, again, feel too comfortable, complacent, and drop our guard. But you also have a number of human traits that keep us safe. For example, our instinct and our intuition. And here I'm drawing upon one of my longtime security favorites, Gavin DeBecker, and his wonderful book, The Gift of Fear, that really is focused on the idea of how important our intuition and our instincts are in keeping us safe. So very important through this time frame that we are cognizant of and we're respectful when we have those feelings, when something feels out of place, something feels wrong, that we recognize that in ourselves and we respect that and try to get ourselves to a safer position or deal with the situation at hand. But again, this can be tricky because people's emotions have been, one, complicated, and two, exhausted by the pandemic. At this point, we have to really push ourselves to be extra sharp and extra vigilant and listen to those intuitions. When we think then about people's behavior, and going back to Tony's introduction, this could be behavior that's associated with a diagnosed or undiagnosed mental health condition, or just situational, that's people reacting to the stressors of the moment. We understand that we're going to apply the idea of universal behavioral precautions. Now, many of you are familiar with the idea of universal precautions, for example, from first aid or working in a medical environment. If someone's bleeding, for example, we can't simply look at that blood and tell if it's healthy or contaminated in some way. So we treat all blood as suspect. We put on our gloves, we put on our masks, we do all those things to keep ourselves safe. Universal behavioral precautions is the idea that there's no one profile, no one look of an individual who may be, again, aggressive, even violent, or in some way experiencing a behavioral crisis. So we have to approach all people, not in a paranoid way, but certainly in an aware way, certainly in a vigilant way, that in this environment especially, people can be very stressed and reactive emotionally. So we think about the basics of situational awareness. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we know that many people are familiar with the idea of situational awareness, but for me, it means two things specifically. It means a conscious effort to be aware every day in all the places we go of the two R's. And the two R's are risks and resources. Risks are the people, places, and things that can hurt me, and resources are the people, places, and things that can help me if something goes wrong. Now, that's going to be important to us because if something does go wrong, we don't want to have to really invent our crisis plan on the fly. We want to have some ideas in mind about how quickly to go really into our action mode. So when we think about, again, situational awareness, it comes down to being tuned in, seeing something, saying something, doing something when a crisis starts to unfold. Now, you may be aware very quickly of the idea of baseline. There are two ways that people's behavior varies from baseline. Behaviors that should not be there, but they are. So this could be all kinds of symptoms or signs of mental illness that are recognizable to us, or the person reports things that are not, associated with everyday life, but their experience, and other behaviors that are, again, we call negative anomalies that should be there, but they're not. And this could be someone who's withdrawn and pulled away and not speaking or not behaving in a way that others around them may typically be behaving. So we're being aware of changes in people's behavior, things that stand out for us as being different, that should catch our eye, that should let us know early on that something is going on with an individual. And early intervention, starting the process of really de-escalating and assisting someone in an emotional crisis, starting it early is almost always better than starting it too late. So why do people become disruptive? Well, it could be a combination. And remember, these are not pure types and they're not mutually exclusive. It could be family problems. And there's lots of stresses in families right now. And some of the stresses are, again, about relationships, and maybe some are financial. We know that many people have lost jobs and lost businesses and lost financial security during this crisis. And of course, we know that we've also had not only an increase in the reports of people struggling with mental health, but also struggling with substance abuse. So substance abuse has increased during this time period, as have medical, obviously, and mental health conditions. So all of these things can commingle in different ways that move someone towards really a loss of control, perhaps, and being more disruptive. So our important distinction then for this discussion is a behavioral emergency for us. And I'll probably use the term, about situational emergencies as well. But a behavioral emergency really is that very, very powerful reaction to an abnormal event. So again, normal reaction to an abnormal event. So any of us with a pre-existing mental health condition or not can get some really bad news. Something can go wrong. Anything can go wrong in our daily life. There could be an emergency, some sort of threatening or traumatic event that really emotionally overwhelms the individual. That's not an indication of a mental health problem. That's, as I said, kind of to be understood given the seriousness of the event. Mental health emergencies, though, suggest that there is an underlying psychiatric or psychological disorder, whether it's diagnosed or not diagnosed, and the behavior we're seeing are likely to be signs and symptoms of that disorder. Now, obviously, these are also not mutually exclusive. Someone can have a very serious pre-existing mental health condition and then in any given day be, really experience a sudden and traumatic sort of experience or event that is, their reaction is not necessarily associated with their mental illness, but more associated with the nature of the crisis. So here again, we know that people do use these terms very interchangeably, mental health and mental illness. Just like our physical health, mental health is a state of well-being in which we're living, loving, laughing, being part of our everyday work. Mental illness, and when we talk about the idea of a mental health disorder or a mental disorder, signifies that there is some level of impairment. That's when something becomes a disorder. I actually hope all of us are capable of great joy and great sorrow, because that's the human experience. That's to be human. But let's say, for example, that someone's sadness is so profound and so prolonged that for days, weeks, and months, they're not able to get out of bed, groom themselves, eat, take care of their family, go to work, etc. We would probably start referring to that as depression, maybe even major depression, because it is impairing their ability to function. So something moves from a reaction or an experience to become a disorder when it starts to impair function. Let's use the other side of that coin. If someone now is so enthusiastic, energetic, excitable, feels invincible, never felt better in their life, that's a great feeling to have, that may also be so extreme that we look at it and consider it as being mania, because it may impair the person's ability to safely be out there in the world and impair their ability to do the other normal things or everyday things they need to do. So here, when we talk about a mental health crisis or mental illness, we're indicating there's an underlying psychiatric disorder. Now, mental illnesses are very common, but they're also still very misunderstood by the general public. And today, this is a number from Johns Hopkins most recently. 1 out of 4 adults suffers from a diagnosable mental health condition in any given year, and probably half of us over the course of our lifespan. Mental health disorders affect all types of people, all ages, every demographic, all parts of the world. And SAMHSA, the U.S. Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, part of federal HHS, Health and Human Services, tells us that pretty soon, psychological disorders, mental health disorders, and substance abuse disorders will surpass all other forms of physical disorders worldwide. So not only are these very prevalent, they're increasing in their prevalence. Mental health conditions, of course, are not static. A person's condition, like our physical health, does change over time, changes sometimes week to week, month to month, certainly over the course of years. And when we see someone in a mental health crisis, that behavior is not usually indicative of their day-to-day experience. Many people, again, function very, very well in society, very well in their personal lives with mental illnesses. And when we're seeing them, and that is, again, maybe recognizing the disruptive behavior that brings them to our attention, we're seeing them on a bad day. That is not, as I said, most people's day-to-day experience. But their health, their mental health can fluctuate given changes with things like stress, again, self-care, health, exposure to trauma. Many different things can move people along this continuum from functioning very well with their mental health to not functioning very well. And people, again, can move up and down the spectrum many times throughout their life. We know that things like discontinuing medications as well as stress can destabilize people's situation. And that when people, again, are destabilized, it actually can make them more vulnerable to other sorts of problems, other sorts of harm. So when we think about what we see, the behavior we'll see, and we'll talk about that more in depth in just a moment, that we might be speaking of today as disruptive or even dangerous, really depends on the nature of the disorder and the severity of the disorder at that moment. But we also know that recovery from mental illness is possible. Recovery here means something different. Twice in the program, we're going to make the analogy of mental illnesses to diabetes. In this context, we know that diabetes is not a condition we cure. People manage it over their lifespan with medication, perhaps, diet, exercise, lifestyle, all kinds of things that may keep it in check. And the person may have a very full, very productive, very satisfying life. Does not mean it goes away. When we think about most of the major mental illnesses, we don't cure them or get them to go away. But again, we have those in a way where the person is actively, through lifestyle, through therapy, through treatment, sometimes through medication, managing that condition, and again, can live a very full, very productive and satisfying life. So when we think about this, recovery means really a time of stabilization and well-functioning. Now, we know the movies and the media often portray people with mental health conditions as being, a menace to society, of being out of control, of being somewhat monstrous. And we know from really real life experience, never mind science, that none of that is true. But the impression that media very often gives can add to misunderstanding, to discrimination and fear, and certainly to stigma. So it's important for us as we start this program really to be square on some of the myths and facts around mental illnesses and around mental health. This, again, is really driven, we know today, through better science of neuroimaging, such as fMRIs and so forth, really from a psychosocial or a biopsychosocial model. There are biological contributors, there are psychological and social factors, all that come together in different ways that may create really the possibility of a mental illness in any one person. But it's not a personal choice. It's not a characteristic or personality trait of being lazy or moral weakness and so on and so forth. We know that people, again, with mental illness, that this is a disease, that this is biologically rooted today, and is not something that people bring upon themselves. But we also know that today, even in a more aware society, stigma is still the greatest barrier to people getting the right kind of help. Feelings of shame, feelings of embarrassment, the perception that people with mental illness are inferior or damaged in some way, really create those conditions that keep people away from the sort of help that would allow them to live those kind of really fruitful lives. Also important for us today, in the time of COVID, especially where people are going through so many medical challenges, the idea of coexisting and co-occurring disorders. Coexisting, meaning that the person has simultaneously a mental health condition and a physical condition. That is very common. 68% of adults with mental health disorders also have medical conditions. About 28% of adults with medical conditions also have mental illnesses. And those kind of feed each other. If you're struggling with a mental illness, it may be more difficult to take care of your physical health needs, and those physical health needs may be barriers to you taking care of any mental health challenges. So this kind of cycles onto itself. We know that it puts people at risk for both short-term and long-term problems, and we know this is increasingly common. Also, the term co-occurring, which is slightly different, meaning the person may be simultaneously struggling with mental health challenges and substance abuse challenges. And there's, again, a whole semester of discussion really about the how and the why these two things go together, but they very often do. But the roots of mental illness, this is the second time I'll use this analogy to diabetes, are the roots of mental illness are biologically based. For example, when we think about diabetes, this is a disorder, of course, of the a disorder of the pancreas, in which the insulin is not producing, the pancreas is not producing insulin in its proper way. We can't say to someone in a diabetic emergency, come on, champ, pull it together, start getting that pancreas to crank out some insulin. That's not going to happen. That's not within the person's control. Well, in mental health disorders, the organ that's implicated, of course, is the brain. And we can't say to someone, come on, pull it together, get that brain to start pumping out serotonin or dopamine or norepinephrine or whatever the neurochemical or neurohormone is that it's in question. That's not going to happen. So this is biologically rooted. And increasingly through better science, better neuroimaging and so forth, we could see how the mechanics of this all work. But we know that this is the organ, of course, of concern. And I think they were probably maybe a generation away from in schools, kids not even being taught these are medical illnesses and these are mental health illnesses. These are all biologically rooted sorts of disorders and illnesses. But there are many different types, as you know. For any of you who've ever seen the big book of psychiatry here, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual lists just about 300 different mental health disorders. Now, for our purposes today, it's not going to be important to talk about those 300. We will talk about some of the more common, but we're going to talk about them in different categories and not necessarily the classic categories of mood disorder, thought disorder, anxiety disorder, and so forth. We're going to make them really based on what we observe today that's going to be important for us in learning how to de-escalate and how to assist people in different mental health crises. We're going to talk about those crises that represent a loss of reality, a loss of hope, loss of control, or a loss of perspective. Now, we understand that these could be caused by a mental illness, by substance abuse in some instances, or even an organic process, which can be something, again, medical happening to the person, something like a lesion, a tumor, some other problem, medical problem affecting the brain or the central nervous system. For us in the moment, it is not going to matter what the diagnosis is. It's not going to matter what the cause is. It's not going to matter if it's because of mental illness, substance abuse, or an organic process. We're going to be dealing with the behavior and communication that we see, talk about how we make sure we could help diffuse or de-escalate it in a safe manner and move the person towards the right sort of help. So when we think about a loss of reality, most often this is thought about in terms of things like psychotic disorders, which are also known as thought disorders, in which there's some sort of break with reality. And we can hear different symptoms discussed that are delusions or hallucinations. Delusions are false beliefs. Hallucinations or false perceptions, what we hear, what we see, things of this nature. Could also be disorganized, thinking, very paranoid thinking. The person who appears or presents to us as being very distractible or disoriented, who may be responding to a lot of internal stimulation, which is overwhelming them. But very often the behavior that we think of disruptive is odd, sometimes bizarre, and illogical to other people who are not having the internal experience of that person in question. Those disorders which are typically characterized by loss of hope are things like mood disorders. In fact, things like depression, when the person feels there's no reason to go on. And here we know that suicide risk is associated with all of the different conditions, but to different degrees. And this is the sort of thing we think about most with suicide, is a loss of hope. When a person feels helpless and hopeless, and again, just so overwhelmed that they're not, don't see a way to go forward in life. Now, these are not exclusive. We can see some of these, loss of hope associated with other disorders besides mood disorders. But loss of control can come in many different forms of being impulsive, destructive, even antisocial in different ways, in which the person can present as angry, as destructive, again, as irritable, as hostile. And we're going to talk about those in greater depth as well. And lastly, loss of perspective. And this was the example I gave earlier of someone who may be so energetic that they are taking great risks. It can be financial risks, it can be physical risks, being out with the wrong sort of clothing. It could be being sexually provocative and dangerous to themselves and others. It can, again, present as the person being invincible. But in this way, the level of energy, of excitement is so profound, it is, again, impairing the person from really being able to safely function, and it's impairing them in that way. So we're going to look at the categories rather than in terms of psychiatric diagnosis or labels of thought disorders and mood disorders. We're going to really focus on what we see and what we hear from that potentially disruptive person or distressed person who may, again, need our help. Now, just for a moment or two to speak a little bit about the nexus with violence. All of the major studies in this area tell us that people with mental illnesses are no more likely to be violent than the average person. This goes all the way back to the beginning of this research, major studies like the MacArthur study done by John Stedman and Henry Stedman rather, and John Monahan and others, up to the modern day. In fact, what we know is people with mental illnesses are more likely to be the victims of violence than the perpetrators of violence. But again, how people with mental illnesses are portrayed in the media, portrayed in movies, portrayed again in discussion in public, do not match up with the reality of this. We know that when dangerousness is increased in individuals with mental illness, it is not just because they have a diagnosis or they have a mental illness. It is usually that mental illness in combination with non-compliance with medication and treatment and the addition of substance abuse. This is again where most of our major studies indicate there is a greater likelihood of violence or aggression with individuals who may have a mental health diagnosis. So let's be clear that dangerousness is a concern, but it is not the concern that, again, is very often made out to be in movies. So when we think in two different strokes very quickly, signs of behavioral health problems, this is general, and then signs of behavioral crises or mental health crises, that will be a different list. So in general, we see change, some sort of real radical change in the person, their appearance, their mood, how they socialize with others, maybe more irritable or jumpy, maybe withdrawing from us, so they're away from work, away from a family as well. But mostly it's changes in day-to-day behavior, including things like eating and sleeping, perhaps feeling more distracted, problems with problem solving and concentration, excessive fear and so forth, and perhaps a general lack of productivity as well as withdrawal. And this may be accompanied by changes in behavior with drugs, alcohol, and other risk-taking behavior. But when we think then about what is a behavioral emergency, that's something different. So our first list there may be indicative that someone is starting to struggle with their mental health. But here we're starting to talk about someone sliding towards a behavioral health emergency. Remember, behavioral health emergency suggests that there's an underlying psychiatric disorder. So again, we have different triggers. You could think about the biopsychosocial aspect of mental illness as being the kindling, all those things that are underlying. And then we have the spark that may put that crisis in motion, really light that kindling up. And that can be, those precipitants could be any sort of sudden dramatic change. Loss of a loved one. Well, in the US, we've lost 750,000 loved ones in the last 20 months from COVID. So lots of people experiencing this sort of loss. Loss of relationships, loss of jobs, of course, problems in school, at work, and certainly being exposed to some sort of threatening or traumatic event, including the sort of disasters I mentioned earlier. But it also could be increased racial, ethnic, religious, or other prejudice or intolerance in our community that has people feel frightened of potentially being assaulted or harassed and intimidated. And lastly, when medications or treatment are discontinued or somehow are not working sufficiently for people, all of these could be destabilizing. Now we know, very often this is tricky because families, again, and sometimes the person themselves can really get involved in a lot of blame and shame about stopping medications. We know stopping medications can be very destabilizing. In some ways, it can be even dangerous for the person. Some medications have to be stopped in a very specific way. But there's a number of common reasons. Stopping medications and having a person decompensate and go into a period of psychiatric crisis is very, very common. And again, without reading each of these bullet points to you, we know there are about 10 or 12 different very common reasons that people do stop their meds. One that really requires explanation is number 6 here, mania addiction. And what that means in plain language is the person who is, again, feeling invincible, energetic, unstoppable, doesn't want that to end. They probably have never felt as good in their life, and they can't see any reason to really make it stop. And again, wouldn't really be interested in a medication for that. But lots of other reasons, ranging from cost to side effects to people, again, who feel that it's an embarrassment to be on psychiatric medications, or perhaps that they don't really feel any difference. They don't notice any change. All could be resistant to staying on medication. The number 10 is difficult because we know some medications actually take weeks to months to really start working. And in that time frame, people could feel that it really doesn't make a difference, so they're not going to stick with that medication. But certainly some of our some of our greatest concern today for this program is when someone is moving into a behavioral health emergency and that sort of destructive or disruptive behavior really comes to our attention. So the psychiatric emergency or behavioral health emergency is something different. It's not your everyday experience of mental illness. It's not the person who's, again, been in a period of stability and functioning well. It's a person who now, again, is experiencing some level of perhaps extreme agitation or dangerousness to self, others, or property, irrational thought, volatile behavior, to other people could seem irrational or unpredictable or out of control. So in this way, it's the more extreme manifestation of those signs and symptoms associated with this disorder. It can be very difficult for us to try to de-escalate and engage a person who is truly in a mental health emergency. So think about this, depending on the conditions, we touched on very quickly, things like a loss of reality or loss of hope. It can be very difficult to get the person's attention and focus. They could be distracted. They could be experiencing other sorts of, stimulation, hearing voices, seeing things in the environment, delusions and hallucinations, as I said. We also know that even stress can affect memory, thinking, and concentration, so it can be difficult for people to follow you. You may be trying to verbally de-escalate someone and saying some really brilliant things that just are not necessarily working. The person may be more withdrawn, reduced speech, have blunted affect or emotions, maybe presenting or responding to you in a very illogical or rambling way. In fact, everything they do can come across to you as being just really bizarre or delusional in that way. So regardless of their reaction, we know the nature of the illness and the signs and symptoms associated with these illnesses can make it very hard for us to engage a person who is in distress or who's being disruptive and try to really embark on a productive strategy of de-escalation. Now, remembering again that the primary organ of involvement today that we're discussing is the brain. And if we look very quickly at these PET scans, and these are from the Stanford University brain scan study going on now for nearly 50 years, we look up to, these two PET scans. The control is you and I at rest on a good day. The top of that image is the prefrontal cortex behind our eyes. This is executive function, decision-making, problem-solving, logic, judgment, reasoning, verbal processing. And then you look at someone who's enraged for whatever reason, whether it's justifiable or they're out of control because of their emotional state. And you see the front of the brain relatively goes dark. But the back of the brain, here, the brain stem that regulates the vital signs, heart rate, blood pressure is through the roof, and the limbic system that regulates emotion, all is still lit up. But that thinking part of the brain, you can see there, the lights have gone off, and you have a person who may not be able to really respond well to the thing you are saying or doing, trying to de-escalate them. Well, that's going to reinforce an important point in just a few moments, that when we're trying to de-escalate people in different either emotional or mental health crises, they are largely responding to our nonverbal communication. And as you see, I've highlighted here, besides problem-solving, decision-making, logic, judgment, reasoning, and impulse control, verbal processing is greatly compromised when the person is really in this agitated state. So when you think then about verbal de-escalation, there is an art and science to this. This is very much rooted in the neuroscience of understanding how we, again, process information under stress. So our initial assessment when we are in our environment, it could be in the home, the community, the workplace, it could be in our houses of worship, it could be all different settings. Our questions really are, what is this we're dealing with? This disruptive behavior we're seeing from an individual. Is this a bad guy? Is it someone who's, means violence to us? Is this someone who is a criminal or an extremist or a terrorist in some ways? Is it a bad guy? Is it a bad guest? It's someone who is in our environment and, maybe they're in our programs, they're in our, again, our community in some way, and they're just being a disruptive person for some reason. It's their nature, or it's part of their again, mental health situation. Or is it just any of us having a bad day? And, if you look at right now, reports of increased levels of air rage, of people who are just, traveling by air travel who have become so just disruptive, in some ways dangerous, that's been a real challenge for the air travel industry. What do we have here? Is someone just having a bad day because they're freaked out about their flight being changed or delayed and baggage and everything else that's going on? So where do we start? When we encounter an individual who appears to us to be distressed, to be disturbed, to maybe be, again, in some way disoriented, we don't always know in the first moments why. Is this intoxication? Is it a medical emergency? Is it a psychiatric emergency? Is it just bad behavior? So if it's possible, and you have to temper almost everything I say, here with if it's possible in the moment, don't be alone in the situation. Because we don't know the person, because we're applying universal behavioral precautions and treating everyone as potentially a challenge to us, we're going to try to extend our care. But if there's others around, whether it's security, law enforcement, or just coworkers, friends, or family, try not to be alone. There's a safety in numbers aspect to this, and it gives us an opportunity, if what we're doing in intervention is not helping, someone else to step in, but if possible, get other people involved. Now, that's not to say we want a crowd around. If there is a crowd of people around, let's try to move some people away so we could focus this person's attention. We could deal with this without an audience that the person may play to, without people who cheer them on or fan the flames of the crisis, which crowds can do, and otherwise just even the noise of other people that may be overstimulating. Calmly, softly, introduce ourselves, who you are. Hi, my name's Steve. I'm from the community center. I'd like to talk to you for a moment. I'm really concerned about you. Are you okay? We're applying a concept that's referred to as supportive acknowledgement. Supportive acknowledgement means I acknowledge it. I see you're distressed. Supportive, I want to help. So here again, we're going to use this approach in most of our contacts. Establish positive eye contact. I know there are some cultural prohibitions and changes you have to be aware of in different cultures about how we make eye contact and between genders and people of different status and so forth. But in general, we try to maintain a warm, constant eye contact with the person. We talked about minimizing distractions, really, again, letting the person know about our care, our interest in helping them, and staying upbeat about this. At the same time, we're being very aware of their nonverbal cues as well, trying to give the person an opportunity to ventilate and blow off some steam without us taking it personally if possible, and trying to assess the situation to give us a chance to know what will be the best approach going forward. Calm, non-threatening approach, quieting it down, short, clear sentences. What does that mean? To me, it means sentences that are 3 to 5, maybe 3 to 7 words tops. Really, again, so they're not overwhelming. Again, simple demands, simple requests, not overwhelming the person, and be truthful and genuine. If you are seen by the person who may already be a little suspicious or paranoid as being deceptive, well, in that way, you're going to lose their trust and their willingness to kind of work with you. And as I said, the person, depending on the nature of their condition, can say some very, very harsh, insulting, and difficult things for you to hear. You have to understand that may be symptoms of their condition and not take it personal, again, and yourself escalate. We think about really allowing the person to express themselves without judgment. You may look at the person's situation and think they've got a great thing going in life and work and so forth, yet they may be profoundly depressed and even speaking about suicide, and you're questioning, like, why? You seem to have it so good. Remember, for it's all experienced through that person's eyes. And it's all, again, changed through the nature of their illness, perhaps, something you can't appreciate. So don't try to convince people that things aren't so bad and they shouldn't be mad or shouldn't be angry, etc. And if the person really is having hallucinations, hearing things that are not there, seeing things, for example, are not there, the best strategy is not to respond to the hallucination. I don't see it, there's nothing there. Again, for the person having the hallucination, it is 100% real. Rather than confirm or deny the hallucination or delusion, speak about how it's making them feel. So, I'm not sure what you're seeing. I'm not seeing anything right now, but I know you're very upset. You seem very frightened. Let me know how I can help. Let's see what we could do to make you more comfortable. So rather than responding to the delusion or hallucination, respond to the feelings, again, in a non-judgmental way, promoting hope without minimizing the person's condition, and being persistent that you want to get them to a safe place and get them the help they need. Always, in all contacts, looking and listening for any level of indication of risk of dangerousness to themselves or others. With an individual in a condition like this, you may have to repeat yourself many times without being frustrated. Remember that verbal processing is compromised. Remember that retaining information and short-term memory may be compromised. So in this way, stay calm, but be prepared to repeat yourself. We talked about keeping yourself focused and centered. We talked about not responding to some of the more unusual or difficult to understand thoughts or behavior. But we're going to focus on how it's affecting them, how they're feeling, and what we could do to calm them. Let me go back for 1 second. The graphic next to me is very telling, very useful. Slow the process down, control your rate and pace so you're not, again, overwhelming the person. Stay positive in your tone and project a calmness. Now, we're going to spend a few moments on calmness in just a moment. But it's also important to have an idea of a threshold in your mind when you may have to actually take action. And that action may be leaving the situation, maybe some other action, but we want you to do this in a controlled manner so you're responding and not reacting simply to the situation. It's also important to hold on to the difference between making a threat and posing a threat. You know that there are some people who threaten behavior, threaten violence, who are never going to do anything. Conversely, there are some people who do dangerous things, even deadly things, who have never made a threat. And there sure are people who've done both, make threats and act on those threats. So we know it's actually very difficult to distinguish, who is really means to act on a threat. But for us, it's a little more simple than that. We understand that people may pose a threat even without making a threat. And we know the best indicators of this are their behavior and their communication, not necessarily if they made a threat or not. And when we think about behavior and communication, we know that this is observable to us. It's the things we hear, maybe changes in voices and volume, how quickly, how slowly they're speaking, physical posture, muscle tension, changes in their coloration, again, eye contact, their stance, all different sorts of nonverbals. And again, I'm not going to belabor this because most of course would recognize people who are looking aggressive towards us. And this starts to look, again, at movements in the eyes and the hands, the face, the shoulders, the arms, all ways people, again, start to broadcast or project a likelihood for aggression. Even if the person says, I'm calm, and you see otherwise, you see their body language contradicts that, go with what you see rather than what you hear. It is much harder for people to mask their nonverbal communication. Now, some direct attack, pre-attack behaviors, someone is really thinking or planning on moving in and assaulting you, scanning and looking around the area, target glancing, looking at you to size you up, see if you have a weapon on you, things of this nature. Rate of blinking in their eyes changes. It can increase or decrease. Normally, most of us blink about 20 times per minute. That's once every 3 seconds or so. This is greatly increased or greatly decreased. You'll notice it. Flanking is moving in position alongside of you for a possible physical attack. Hesitation and response is when the person, again, is thinking through, really concentrating on the plan potentially to attack you and not listening well to what's going on, what you're saying. And of course, someone who takes somewhat of a fighter stance, which we'd recognize in how they move their feet, they move their hands, and so forth. So there are certainly ways that people broadcast when they're becoming more aggressive. So I want to think about 2 things quickly, and then we're going to move on to verbal de-escalation, which will be the heart of our program this morning. We hope that you recognize this behavior early. We hope that you can move away for it or to get the right kind of help and start a process of calming and de-escalating the person, which we'll focus on in a moment. But there may be situations that unfold very quickly. There could be situations that unfold that catch us off guard. And sometimes, even in our best efforts to verbally de-escalate a situation, it doesn't work. And the person escalates further and may actually escalate to the point of being physical. If you're directly confronted, still try to stay calm in yourself, keep focused, positive eye contact, and be thinking about getting yourself out of the situation. If you can, start to put time and distance between you and this individual. And again, as we said, if possible, Don't be alone with someone who seems to be losing their ability to control themselves. Again, when we think about this, bringing other people into the mix may mean police or security, but take it seriously. Someone who is losing control like this, again, may have a very difficult time to pull it back. And lastly, before we change our direction to verbal de-escalation, let's talk about if in fact it does escalate to violence. As I said, we don't want to just react. We want to respond to the situation. We want to thoughtfully think about what kind of things will make ourselves safe. Getting away from the situation means not simply running from danger. It means purposely running towards safety. In fear and panic, you could actually run yourself into a more dangerous situation. This means you came into the environment scanning for the 2 R's, risks and resources. What could hurt me? What could help me? And knowing that you need to move towards those resources if things go wrong. So if something really begins to become aggressive or violent, your goal is to move as quickly as you can away from that and keep moving until you're safe. Remember, your priority is safety, not pride. Don't worry about what anybody else thinks or says. It's about surviving this hostile encounter. If a person does become physical and you are assaulted, a few things to keep in mind. If you have any sort of tools on you, and I mean here an alarm or a whistle or just to scream, bring attention to yourself or perhaps scare the other person. Make as much noise as you can. Protect yourself by whatever means you can. And some basic ideas. Don't turn your back on an attacker, and don't lower your guard or drop your guard and get low. This actually makes you more vulnerable. Stay on your feet and stay upright. If you've been knocked down, try to get back to your feet as quickly as possible. And when you're on your feet, it should be moving. Keep moving and running as quickly as you can, running towards other people to other safe places if possible. Now, physical sorts of skills, we like to think of as the last resort. But if you have to, if this is your last resort, do everything you physically have to defend yourself and physically get away from that situation. But short of that, we know that many, if not most situations, do not escalate to the point of physical aggression or violence, and there is an opportunity for verbal de-escalation. So let's focus the next part of our program really on verbal de-escalation skills. Escalation comes from the word escala in Latin, the stairs, walking up, walking down. Escalation means someone's going up. De-escalation, of course, means they're going down. And verbal de-escalation is a process. It's an empirically sound, science-based process that understands what sort of things escalate and de-escalate people emotionally and how we could use those strategically. Remembering again, our key tool now in verbal de-escalation is verbal and nonverbal communication. So our 4 goals to begin are opening and keeping open the channels of communication with the distressed individual. Try to get them talking. When they're talking, they're probably not doing danger to themselves or others or anything else that's counterproductive. Keeping them talking may also allow for some ventilation to blow off some steam and give them a chance to settle down. As part of verbal de-escalation, we're going to use some very specific active listening skills, which I'll speak about in a few moments. And again, trying to maintain some level of control of the situation. So let's be clear about that again. You're going to hear that several times. The centerpiece of de-escalation is controlling ourselves in a manner that influences how the other person controls themselves. It is not efforts to control the other individual. When we try to control the individual, very often that backfires and escalates it even further. But you also have to remember that reasoning with a person when they are totally enraged, when they're again totally overwhelmed, may not necessarily be possible. We may have to again physically make ourselves in the situation safe before we actually can use a verbal de-escalation process. And the other thing to remember, 2 things, is verbal de-escalation skills are not necessarily natural and intuitive. Our natural response to disturbing or distressing or frightening behavior is to run from it. And in this instance, you may be making a decision to purposely try to engage with the individual, calm them in the situation, and again, try to get them the right sort of response or help they need. I also know that these skills work best when you begin to use them in everyday life, not waiting for a crisis. Because if you're using them in everyday life, they'll become very natural and very automatic and accessible to you, not in a crisis, trying to remember what was the thing I learned, in that training or in that class the last time I've had that. So remember, this is not trying to control the person. It's really based in controlling ourselves. This means starting by getting ourselves in check, taking that deep breath, clearing our head, focusing our attention on other individuals to begin a verbal de-escalation process. Some of these, again, nonverbals are not just volume, tone, rate of speech, and so forth, although we will get there and those are important, but even things like our physical tension or breathing and so forth that people can pick up on. Now, de-escalation is based in a neuroscience concept that's known as entrainment. And you hear this in the slide, on the slide spelled with the letter E, entrainment. And what this means is we have a natural tendency to synchronize with each other. And you know this very simply, if you hang out with someone who's very relaxed, it tends to be relaxing for us. If you hang out with someone who's very anxious, it tends to make us more anxious. It's somewhat contagious. And this is all due to a part of the brain referred to as the mirror neurons. The mirror neurons are what allows us to read other people's behavior and to synchronize it in a way that we could be kind of in the same place, kind of connecting with people and get in the same kind of frame of mind. Now, we could use that strategically. Knowing that people have a tendency to synchronize with us, we can use this neuroscience principle and a process of entrainment to not control, but certainly to influence others around us. So however we are, I'm going to talk about being professional, not as someone with necessarily always a degree, advanced training, or a job in the field, but being professional, that we're not being just casual with this. We're applying professional skills here. Means that we have an edge. We have a better chance of de-escalating situations, but also doesn't mean that we're going to be the best de-escalator for everybody and in every situation. So it's important for us to know our limits, know that even the most skillful and professional de-escalators sometimes let other people take over. Now, you heard and you saw in my introduction, I've worked with all kinds of law enforcement and intelligence agencies. I still work as a resource to the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Force and our counterterrorism programs. And I've been on hostage negotiation scenes many times and seen even the most skillful negotiator have to turn it over to a different negotiator if they're not connecting, if the process is not working for them. So go into this with a reasonable expectation that even if you're saying and doing everything right, you may ultimately not influence the other person. But as you start a process of verbal de-escalation, make sure you are safe first. You're coming to this situation to become part of the solution, not yourself to become part of the problem. Make sure you're physically okay, get the resources to help you need to begin this right. And that might mean security, law enforcement, or others around you. Clear your mind and focus all of your energy and attention on the individual of concern. So I said this earlier, remember, this is not a formula, it's not a script, it's not say this or do that and it's gonna make a difference. It's really about being yourself. It's not so important to say exactly the right thing, but it's about connecting with the individual. Now, if you work in the mental health field or you've studied this to any level, you know this. In the world of psychotherapy, in the world of counseling, the single greatest variable that predicts the success of treatment is how well the individual connects with their counselor or their therapist. Verbal de-escalation works very much the same way. It's about making a connection with the individual. And I will tell you this, you see this in big print here. It's incredibly important to protect the person's dignity. They may already feel a tremendous degree of shame or embarrassment about behavior they can't control. They may know in some ways that what they're doing is frightening or unpleasant to other people. They may be, again, very remorseful of things they're saying or doing. Don't add to that. Don't moralize, don't judge. And we talk about the dignity domino. Once a person's dignity falls, once it is stripped from them, it removes all other prohibitions, removes all other inhibitions, and it could raise the risk of dangerousness greatly. So we know there are barriers to connecting with people. Be aware with them, Know that these are pitfalls. Know that these can, again, prevent you from connecting, whether it's judging or criticizing or name calling or not listening or being too bossy and ordering people around, or especially arguing with the person, will get you nowhere and it'll likely raise the risk. So important to depersonalize and not get in a power struggle. Depersonalize anything the individual's saying. It could be insulting, it could be agitating, it could be demeaning to you, your family, and all your beliefs. We need to let this roll off of our behavior, focus on the person, focus on the behavior and communication. You are not the reason. You are not the problem. So don't take it personally. But it is important to get off on the right foot. As I said, make the first minutes matter. Introduce yourself and who you are, why you're there, what you want to do. Remember the concept of supportive acknowledgement. I see you seem upset. You seem confused. You seem frightened. How can I help you? I'd like to help you. Let me help you. These are the ideas of supportive acknowledgement. Ask for the person's first name and use their name. If they'd prefer to stay formal, use their last name if necessary, but get a name and use it frequently. Also, try to maintain or frequently use positive eye contact. We talked about making the environment safe. We spoke about allowing some level of ventilation, but ventilation works best in combination with validation. Ventilation is the person saying their thing, getting their ideas off their chest, saying, really ventilating, as it were. Validation is you affirming that, pushing back. Okay, I see. Wow, that's really interesting. Tell me about that. It's those little things we say or do to let the person know that we're tuned in, we're attending to them, and we care. Sound concerned, sound interested. We may also need to adjust our personal space. And obviously, this has changed somewhat in a social distancing world of COVID. Normally, we would say that our personal space in our culture is about an arm's length, is about 3 feet away. We've all been at kind of the 6 feet rule for the last 18, 20 months. But we know that if we're too close to people, it can raise their agitation. It can make them uncomfortable. If we're too far, it sends a different message, one that we might be frightened or we don't necessarily really want to connect with them. So adjust our personal distance from them as appropriately. When we talk about start and stop questions, this means give more positive directions than negative. And to be even more clear, instead of don't do that, it would be, can you do this? So let me give you a very dramatic example. Some of the groups I train, as I mentioned, are law enforcement. I've trained in many major cities, law enforcement who work at bridges and tunnels, and especially those people on bridges to de-escalate when they have suicide risk and potential jumpers on the bridge. A positive request would be, can you step closer to me? Rather than, can you move, can you, or don't go any closer to the edge. So positive actions rather than negative. And again, try to make non-emotional requests, not like, can you stop crying for a moment sort of thing. Don't worry about exactly saying or saying or doing the right thing. Be yourself, be real, be genuine, and be connected with the person, avoiding arguing, moralizing, or diagnosing on the spot. For someone who's really agitated, especially the person who's the bad guest or someone having a bad day, we may want to use a 3-step limit setting process. Step 1, let's say the person's yelling, screaming, cussing, saying bad things about me and my mom. Here again, I'll say, hey, listen, I understand how upset. I see how upset you are about the situation. Sounds like you're really angry. But if you want to talk about this, if you want to try to sell this, please stop yelling, screaming, cursing, threatening, whatever the hostile behavior is. If you're not able to stop that, I'm not sure we're going to be able to continue the conversation right now, but that's your choice. You see what I'm doing here? I'm setting some limits. I'm also shifting the responsibility back to the person. So it's up to you if you want to have this conversation. I set a limit. Number 2, I'll remind them of the limit. Okay, reinforce the limit. Sir, ma'am, please, I've asked you at least once before, stop with yelling, screaming, cursing, threatening me, whatever the behavior is. I would like to hear your concerns. I do want to help, but I'm not going to be able to help you if you continue to threaten or be, so hostile. We remind them of their responsibilities for their actions. And the third time around, kind of a 3 strikes you're out model, It doesn't seem like you're able to really control that right now. So we're going to have to end this conversation, and we're going to have to ask you to leave, the office, leave the environment, wherever we are. If you're not able to leave, we'll, get help. So, get help in you leaving, which again, you want to make sure it doesn't come across as a threat that will have security or the police drag you out of here. But then you end the discussion. So you could think about scenarios with, very angry people, very aggressive people, where this may be an appropriate strategy. If the person really is in the throes of a very acute psychiatric emergency, they may not be able to really process or respond to those limits very well. But when you can, there's a benefit to this process in the right scenarios, and you could try this and see if the person does respond, regardless of diagnosing the situation or understanding the root cause of their behavior. You could try a limit setting process as part of a verbal de-escalation approach to see if that maybe works. And it does send a good message that your organization does want to help, again, know about problems, wants to be part of the solution if possible. But we need kind of a cooperative person to work with us on that. And then if we end the conversation, it's not because we don't want to help. It's not because we're frightened. It's just because their behavior is making it impossible at the moment to, again, address the situation on hand. Now, as I said, depending on the nature of the emergency, the person may not be able to process even that limit setting. So we know that when people are in a state of rage, or because of the changes neurochemically in different psychiatric emergencies, we could have grave differences, as we looked at before with this diagram, in problem solving, decision making, logic, judgment, reasoning, and processing the verbal information you're sharing. So now it becomes even more important to focus on nonverbal communication. Now, again, we know on a good day and in most situations, the majority of information people are getting from us is nonverbal anyway. But here, we have to increasingly focus on our nonverbal communication. Again, as you see immediately behind me, the statement that, yes, we recognize there is cultural variation in nonverbal communication. If you know about different cultures, you can make these adjustments. If not, just be aware that some of the things you're saying or doing may not have the desired effect because they may be translated through these cultural filters in different ways. So we become more attentive to our nonverbals, where we stand. We spoke before about being kind of in a normal interaction zone of about 3 or 4 feet away. We're much closer, potentially raises anxiety. We're much further, potentially changes the dynamic as well, again, in a negative way. So personal space is something that's in our control. Likewise, how we sit and stand. If you're not familiar with this, we're recommending that rather than being flat-footed and facing directly towards an agitated person, kind of in a more confrontational stance squared off, we're going to recommend very subtly you pivot your foot, one foot, from being parallel to now being perpendicular. We'll call this the L stance. And as you move your foot, you'll notice your body follows, and you're a little more in a side stance where we're a smaller target, a less vulnerable target, where we're less challenging, where we have greater balance, and we're in a position to move more quickly towards safety if we have to. So we adjust our stance very quietly, very subtly in the interest of safety. Likewise, if we're sitting and talking with someone, and this is preferable because it's more calming, we know people are less likely to lash out at us aggressively from a seated posture. And if the person is very overwhelmed, it may actually be safer for them as well. But we adjust how we sit. And yes, there can be cultural variation of this as well. Solar, as you see in the photograph, is sitting squarely and openly. I'm not crossed, I'm not closed, I'm not guarded, squarely and openly towards the individual. Leaning forward does 2 things. It demonstrates my attention. I'm really, really listening to you. And 2, I'm halfway out of that chair if it goes wrong and I do have to leave in a hurry, again, in the interest of safety. Positive eye contact, and relax here does not mean drop your guard. Relax means project a calmness, project again a way that we influence the other to be calm themselves. We're thoughtful about our nonverbal language and body language, again, shrugging, pointing, again, that you may not even realize you're doing, that may be changing the message, or the individual may not be very receptive to your verbal message, but this is what they're getting from you. They're seeing just the nonverbal communication. So be mindful of our posture. and our positioning, our stance, our movements, that we're not moving very quickly or aggressively, not pointing, not shrugging, and really, again, as much as possible, project the calmness. This is what we mean by relax, not just drop our guard, including your facial expression. If your body language is calm, but you look very, very frightened or upset or distressed in your own face, that's our primary channel of communication. Now, here, this kind of message about smiling, I would suggest needs to be tempered with the reality of the moment. You want your affect, your expression, your emotion to be congruent to the situation. If the person is telling you about something tragic that's happened to them, you want to look like you get it and you understand. If you're sitting there with a big goofy grin on your face just because you've been told to smile through all these crises, the message may be that you don't get it. Either you don't care or you don't understand the seriousness of the situation. So you do want your affect and tone to be congruent. And then we think about paraverbal communication. Paraverbal communication is not what you say, but how you say it. And this includes things like rate of speech, our volume, our tone, and so forth. So let me give you a few pointers here. If someone is being very loud with you, the recommendation is we start speaking a little more loudly than we normally do. Not louder than the other person, not over the top, but more loudly than we normally do. And then gradually and incrementally, we start to bring our volume down. Again, through that process of entrainment, again, through the neuroscience and the understanding of the mirror neurons, we are leading that person down. We're influencing their volume by how we control our volume. Well, that same concept works with rate of speech. In a crisis, someone may be speaking very quickly. Maybe they can't even slow down if they wanted to. But we would then start speaking a little more quickly than we normally do. Gradually and incrementally, we slow ourselves in a way that influences the other party to slow themselves. Again, the focus is on controlling ourselves in a manner that influences the other, not controlling. Tone. Very careful with anything that comes across as sarcastic or condescending. And unless you know the person very well, I would stay away from the use of humor. That can indicate you don't get the seriousness of their situation or you're making light of it in some way. And lastly, inflection or emphasis. You could change the emphasis on a word, a phrase, even a single syllable in a manner that completely changes the intended meaning. And to a person who's operating primarily in the nonverbal domain, this is what they're getting from you. Here's an example of a simple sentence, 6 words long, with 4 clearly different messages based on inflection. The sentence is, I didn't say you were stupid. If I said, I didn't say you were stupid, it means someone else said it. I didn't say you were stupid means I might be thinking it, but I didn't say it. I didn't say you were stupid. I'm talking about your buddy over there. Or I didn't say you were stupid. You don't want to know what I said, but it wasn't that. So there are all kinds of ways messages change with emphasis. This is one of the problems we have with text messaging today, is you don't get the inflection. But to a person in an emotional crisis, they're very tuned into nonverbal communication, and that little change in your inflection might be what sets them off. Lastly, the concept of congruence, making sure our verbal and nonverbal messages match and support each other. If we look one way, say I'm calm, but I physically don't look calm, or say I care and I physically don't look like I care. We again contradict ourselves. We come across as being disingenuous or insincere rather, and again undermines our ability to connect with people. I want to speak mostly about reflective listening here for a moment, because there is a good technique that we could use in crisis conditions. And this is regardless if it's a behavioral crisis or a mental health crisis. Again, as a way of connecting. Now, many of you are familiar with the idea that reflective listening involves paraphrasing, repeating back to people elements of what they've said. But what I'm going to suggest to you in crisis conditions is we keep our communication, our reflection back to people short, remember, 3 to 5, maybe top 7 words. And you make sure in your one concise statement, you get both the emotion and the subject matter of concern. So let me give you an example. Let's say I'm a therapist or a counselor in the community. Every Thursday, I have this 16-year-old client, Johnny. And Johnny's been referred by the courts for counseling because Johnny's a little hoodlum and he's always in trouble. And Johnny says to me in counseling today, Steve, I'm really upset. I have court next week. And if I get that same judge I had last time, oh man, I know that guy hates me. He's going to let me have it if he sees me in this courtroom again. If I said, so John, you're back in court, huh? That's reflective listening. Or John, sounds like you're really nervous. That's reflective listening too. But here, and watch the words, Johnny, sounds like you're very nervous about court. That was 6 words. And what did I get? Nervous about court. I heard your emotion. I hear the subject matter. I get it. We're on the same page. So especially in crisis conditions where the outcome may be serious, and you don't have a lot of time and you have these other challenges in communication, make sure you reflect both the emotion and the subject matter. Listen, give verbal indications you're listening. Don't interrupt the person. Allow the ventilation. Validation means that you're affirming them. You're saying, I hear you. Sometimes when we say, I understand, the natural response is, no, you don't. So maybe I change that phrasing to, I can only imagine, or I can't imagine how difficult that is, things like that. When I talk about not defecting roles, you could say, I can appreciate, I can imagine how upsetting this is for you. But if you cross that line and say, yeah, I'm really angry about this too. I'm really angry about the government's policy or the employer's policy about something to do with vaccines or masks or mandates or whatever. Once you cross the line and you take the other person's side, whether you actually agree with them or not is separate. But once you kind of cross that line and defect roles, it makes it very difficult to come back and enforce any sort of limits. So remain neutral. It's not important to agree with them or disagree with their position or their belief. It's important to be skillful in taking the temperature down and de-escalating the situation. Some ideas that may backfire, of course, when we get all worked up, we're raising our voice, we bring in people who don't need to be in the situation. We're again arguing, we're losing, if you're arguing with the person, you've lost this opportunity for de-escalation already. Stay away from sarcasm, stay away from profanity. This is what I mean by being professional. Even this isn't your paid job, this is how we remain professional. We're not attacking the person's character. We're not calling them names. And it's not helpful to make comparisons. Well, we have someone else with the same situation and they're not having this reaction. That's not helpful. Some do's and don'ts as we start to wind down our program in a few moments. Some do's. Follow your instincts. Follow your intuition in how serious the situation is and how to connect. Keep your safety at the top of your priorities. Always keep in mind the safety route and escape route for you, again, if it goes wrong. So think about where the exits are, where you can escape. Be mindful of the person's physical movements, be mindful of any potential weapons. If you're working in an agency or even with family or friends, it's helpful to identify code words that lets people know when it has reached an emergency level and you need additional help. We spoke about eye contact and keeping other people out the environment. But again, try to remind the person of their responsibilities. This was the limit setting approach. I'd like to help. I want to hear about your situation. Tell me how I could help, but I need you to work with me. Let's talk. And if we're keeping this in the realm of talking, as I said, people are not doing. Use their name. We said make eye contacts, paraphrase, re-straighten, re-clarify, give individuals options within reason. And again, we talk about maintaining eye contact. You see the 60% eye contact. That means we don't want to come across as staring or glaring, but we do want to be making eye contact more than we're not. Be sincere, be assertive, project that calmness to influence others. Some don'ts: diminishing the person's belief, telling them they have no reason to be angry, of course, losing our temper, being overly wordy in our explanations, simply telling them to calm down, criticizing or laughing at the person, touching an individual in this state of mind is usually not helpful. Again, ignoring them if it comes across as we don't care, we don't understand. The natural human tendency is to turn up the volume or turn up the heat. So here, make sure we do communicate that we get it. We're giving them our attention. Try to stay away from moves. Sometimes we do this unintentionally, like rolling our eyes or things like that, which diminish the seriousness of their concerns. And really stay away from making false promises, because as soon as that, again, you're not able to come through on that, the person's lost a lot of faith and belief in you. So basic idea is what happens next. We're trying to calm an individual down. If they calm down, maybe we could talk through the situation, identify what they need. Maybe they need psychiatric emergency care. They need to be, in the hospital emergency department for an evaluation. maybe expedited connection to outpatient services, maybe to be hospitalized. Maybe they need something else completely different. But if we are able to get them calmed down, we have a better chance of really hearing that and working through those needs. If they don't calm down, either because we're not able to, or their condition is so acute, remembering it's not always our failure if we don't de-escalate, it may be time again for us to trust our instincts, back out of the situation, get other people, including police or security, to get involved with other options to get this person towards safety. When this is over, however it ends, this contact with a disruptive, distressed, disturbed person, maybe even an aggressive, hostile, or violent person, it's important to make sure you take care of yourself. Make sure you're okay physically, but also emotionally. At an organizational level, it's important to be able to have a chance to sit down and talk this through. You know, what went right? Excuse me, what went wrong? How do we change our approach for other situations like this in the future? But it's equally important, if not more, to make sure you have a chance to ventilate and talk to someone about what this was like for you, and to get that support and validation from others as well. Don't be alone with the situation. We know that these could be very unsettling. You know, an encounter with a distressed or disturbed person, it can be frightening in some instances. So make sure you're talking to someone, whoever you trust. It could be, you know, a professional or a non-professional, friends, family, neighbors, coworkers. It could be a clergy member. It could be a counselor. It could be if you work in an organization that has access to an employee assistance program or EAP, all helpful there as well. But even if you've just witnessed, you weren't even the center of the storm, but you've witnessed one of these incidents, they can be very emotionally unsettling. And even though it's indirect, can still be important for you to reach out and get help. So in closing out, just as we were being proactive in reaching out to others who are distressed or struggling with containing, really, again, some of the powerful emotions that people are experiencing because of our present situation and where we've been the last 20 months, or it's a person who is losing some degree of control because of an underlying mental health or other condition, it's important in thinking of our own self-care to do this proactively. Not to wait till we're feeling the impact of this, not to wait to see if there's any problems in a day, a week, or a month, but proactively reach out and get support for ourselves after a hostile or difficult contact. And I'll close with this thought for today, and then we'll have time for a few minutes for questions. People do ask me, like, Steve, what's the most important thing to say? What's the most important thing to do? And I'll say to folks, you know, paraphrasing this quote from Maya Angelou, when it's all said and done, people won't remember what you said and they won't remember what you did, but they will remember how you made them feel. So more than anything else, focus your attention on connecting with the individual, conveying your care and your concern, your empathy, and your willingness to jump in and help them and be a part of the solution. Folks, thank you so much for making the time to be with us today. I appreciate Tony and the organization inviting me. Remember, again, this need to keep ourselves safe is a team sport. All of us do have to play a role in applying these ideas. And as I said earlier, if you apply them in your everyday life to challenges in your home and your community, they're going to be more accessible to you in a real urgent situation. So with that, I'll say thank you so much. I'll stay online for a few moments for questions. You can enter them in the chat window. It's very complicated. You can email them to me as well, or reach out to me in my office here outside of the New York City area. But again, I want to thank you so much for your attention and your invitation to be here with you today. Tony, I will turn it back over to you for any closing comments.
Okay. No, we just wanted to thank you, Steve. This was very informative.
Okay, Tony, thank you so much. I see there's one or two questions here.
Yes.
I'll answer that. This is from Dove. In my position, Director of Security, primary interviewer member. Okay, so if we encounter a suspicious individual, however, in nature conversation, need to weigh safety of congregation versus disturbed individual to move on down the road. So yeah, I can appreciate that. And one of the things, Dove, I think that's important is if we do safely and effectively de-escalate individuals who may represent either a threat or a disruption to the congregation, the more successful we are to do that, the less it's likely they return in a more hostile position. So the end game may be that we do want people to move down the road, but how we move them down the road still becomes really important. It sounds like you said here you've had some winning encounters, and I would bet those winning encounters are probably those in which the person left feeling respected. Tony, thanks so much. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording at this point, and I will send you all the materials over the next days. Thank you so much, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.